Stop for a second and think about it. What if cancer isn't completely random? According to the American Cancer Society, more than 40% of cancer cases are directly linked to lifestyle and environment. That means a huge part of the risk isn't about luck or fate, but about what you do every day. I'm not a doctor, I'm a physicist. And in physics, we don't accept outcomes if we don't understand the mechanism that produces them. So when I look at the human body, I don't see a system operating randomly. I see a biological machine that follows very clear laws. And if a system follows laws, then its outcomes will also change when you change the initial conditions. For many decades, long-term studies have shown that simple habits repeated every day can significantly alter your cancer risk. And the interesting thing is, these factors don't come from drugs or advanced technology. They come from normal behaviors that you can start as early as tomorrow. Imagine your body as a city operating non-stop, where every day billions of cells produce waste that needs to be collected and processed, so the system doesn't get overloaded. And in your body, the lymphatic system is the network that transports that waste out. The interesting thing is that this system doesn't have a central pump like the heart, but relies almost entirely on your body's hydration status and movement, which means if you're dehydrated, the entire process slows down significantly. A study from the University of Barcelona shows that people over 60 are often dehydrated by 8 to 12% without realizing it. And when that happens, lymphatic flow becomes less efficient, leading to waste buildup and increased inflammatory response in the body. Low-grade chronic inflammation is now seen as one of the underlying factors linked to the onset of many types of cancer, including colon and bladder cancer. And this is not speculation, but has been supported by many long-term studies. For example, Harvard's Nurses' Health Study that followed more than 88,000 women for many years showed that those who drank enough water had up to a 45% lower risk of colon cancer compared to those who drank little. After a night of sleep lasting 6 to 8 hours, your body falls into a state of relative dehydration, like a system that has been temporarily shut down and needs to be restarted. And one of the simplest ways to do that is to drink about 400 to 600 ml of water right when you wake up, before you do anything else. This action not only replenishes fluids, but also reactivates the transport systems in the body. And if you combine it with a bit of light movement, such as walking around the house or taking a short walk outside, you create a synergistic effect, because according to research from the Karolinska Institute, movement can significantly increase lymphatic flow. All of this is not some miraculous solution, but basic groundwork that helps other biological mechanisms in the body function more effectively. And if that foundation isn't solid, then what you build on top of it will also struggle to perform as expected. And if you go further, you'll realize that your body is not simply you, but a complex system containing countless living organisms that coexist and interact with one another. Even before modern science developed strongly, biologists already knew that the human gut contains a large amount of bacteria, and although we couldn't count them precisely as we can today, the idea that the body is an ecosystem has existed for a very long time. What matters here is not the exact number, but the role of this microbiome in regulating what happens inside you. The gut microbiome doesn't just participate in digestion, but also directly influences the immune system. And when the immune system is disrupted, its ability to recognize and eliminate abnormal cells is also affected. You can imagine the immune system like a security system, and the microbiome is part of that system, helping to define what is normal and what is dangerous. When this balance is broken, the system starts to react incorrectly, sometimes overlooking cells that should be eliminated. This leads to a state that scientists call low-grade chronic inflammation, a process that occurs quietly but continuously. And according to many studies from the 1970s and 1980s, prolonged inflammation is linked to changes in the cellular environment in an unfavorable direction. In such an environment, abnormal cells have more opportunity to survive instead of being eliminated immediately. Now the question becomes very interesting. If the problem lies in the balance of the microbiome and the inflammatory response, then can we influence this system through what we eat or not? And the answer, based on basic biological observations, is yes. Fermented foods, which have existed in the human diet for thousands of years, provide beneficial bacteria that can influence the internal environment of the gut. When these bacteria thrive, they produce compounds that the body can use, including short-chain fatty acids like butyrate. What's interesting about butyrate is that it is not only an energy source for intestinal cells, but also plays a role in regulating cell behavior, including activating the process that biologists call apoptosis, which is the controlled self-destruction of damaged cells. You can think of this process like a quality control mechanism, where faulty components are removed before they cause bigger problems. If this mechanism works well, many issues can be prevented very early. But if it weakens, abnormal cells can accumulate over time. As you get older, another phenomenon begins to appear, which is that the intestinal barrier becomes less effective, allowing more unwanted substances to enter the bloodstream, and this contributes to increased inflammation throughout the body. Although the term leaky gut wasn't common at the time, the idea of declining intestinal barrier function has been studied in physiology long before. Fermented foods, through supporting the microbiome, can help strengthen this system, reducing the penetration of harmful factors and thereby reducing pressure on the immune system. Another important point is the diversity of the microbiome, because the more diverse a system is, the more stable it becomes, like an ecosystem in nature. If only a few types of bacteria dominate, the system becomes vulnerable to changes. But when many different types coexist, they create a balance that helps maintain a stable state. And to maintain that diversity, you not only need to introduce beneficial bacteria from fermented foods, but also need to provide them with suitable nutrition, such as fiber from plants. Fiber isn't there to feed you directly, but to feed these bacteria. And when they are well nourished, they perform functions that benefit the entire system. All of this leads to a fairly clear conclusion when viewed from a physics and biology perspective. What you eat doesn't just affect you at the energy level, but also changes the internal environment where important processes take place. And when that environment changes, the probability of events like the development of abnormal cells also changes accordingly. This is not a miraculous solution, but another example of how small changes, when repeated every day, can gradually reshape the way the system operates. And this is where most people start to misunderstand their own body, because we tend to think that the body works in a very simple way, like a machine with individual parts that can be repaired independently. But in reality, it's exactly the opposite. The body is an extremely complex system with many overlapping layers of control, where each biological process depends not only on itself, but also on a whole series of other factors happening simultaneously. In physics, when you look at a complex system, you never try to understand it by completely separating each part. Instead, you have to understand how those parts interact with one another. And this is also true in biology. Small changes in daily behavior, such as drinking enough water or eating a certain food, may seem insignificant at first glance, but when you repeat them hundreds or thousands of times over many years, they begin to accumulate and create major changes in the way the system operates. This is not an abstract idea, but an inevitable consequence of accumulation processes in nature, where small initial deviations can lead to very different outcomes over time. Another important point that many people overlook is that the systems in the body do not operate independently. The immune system, endocrine system, nervous system, and digestive system are all tightly linked through chemical and electrical signals. And this means that when you change one part of the system, you are indirectly changing many other parts at the same time. For example, when you improve the gut microbiome, you don't just affect digestion, but also affect inflammation, hormones, and even brain function. This is exactly why a small change, if placed in the right spot in the system, can create a much larger ripple effect than you expect. In physics, we call this a systems effect, where the overall response cannot be predicted simply by looking at each individual part. And when you start looking at the body this way, you will realize that the habits we're talking about are not disconnected tips, but ways to adjust the initial conditions of the system. When the conditions change, the way the system responds also changes in a predictable way. This explains why the same factor, such as inflammation, can affect many different types of diseases, because it is part of the common foundation that many processes depend on. And when you understand this logic, you will begin to see that the simple habits we're talking about are not random advice, but specific ways to intervene at key points in the system. You don't need to change everything at once. You only need to change the points that have the greatest impact. And to do that, you have to understand the system well enough to know where those points are. This is exactly the approach that science uses, not by looking for a single solution to every problem, but by understanding the structure of the system and impacting the parts that have the potential to create the biggest change. And once you start looking at the body this way, what previously seemed complicated and confusing will become much more logical, because you are no longer looking at each individual phenomenon, but at how the entire system operates as a whole. And when you start looking at the body as a system, rather than a collection of disconnected parts, you will realize that one of the simplest ways to intervene in that system is actually movement, specifically walking, an action so simple that many people never think it could be related to deep processes inside the body. But if you look from a scientific perspective, this starts to become very interesting, because a large-scale study by the American Cancer Society that followed about 1.4 million people for many years showed that those who maintained regular physical activity had a significantly lower risk of many types of cancer compared to those who were less active. And this is not a small result, but a consistent trend that appeared across many different population groups. The important question is not, is walking good, but why does it have such a deep impact? And to answer that question, we need to go back to a very important observation in biology made in 1931 by the scientist Otto Warburg, who noticed that cancer cells use energy in a different way than normal cells, a phenomenon later called the Warburg effect. Specifically, instead of using oxygen efficiently to produce energy like healthy cells, cancer cells rely more on glucose and fermentation, even when oxygen is available, and this creates a systemic vulnerability. If you understand this, you will start to see that the environment in which cells exist plays an extremely important role, because if you can change that environment, you can influence the ability of these cells to develop. When you move, especially walking at a moderate level, your body begins to use glucose as a primary energy source, which reduces the amount of circulating glucose in the blood, and over time, this can affect the fuel that cancer cells depend on. At the same time, movement increases heart rate and blood flow, helping deliver more oxygen to the tissues in the body. And this is equally important, because an oxygen-rich environment is not the ideal condition for cancer cell development. In the way Warburg described, you can imagine this like changing the conditions in a physical system, where some states become less stable when the environment changes. This does not mean that walking will destroy cancer. That is an overly simplistic understanding, but it does mean that you are changing the internal environment in a direction that reduces the ability of abnormal cells to develop. And what's important here is repetition, because one walk doesn't create a big difference, but when you repeat this behavior every day for many years, you are continuously adjusting the biological conditions in the same direction. Metabolism studies also show that regular exercise improves insulin sensitivity, which helps the body control glucose more effectively, reducing large fluctuations in blood sugar. And this in turn continues to affect the environment in which cells exist. Another factor often overlooked is the impact of movement on the immune system, because when you move, you not only change metabolism, but also stimulate the circulation of immune cells, helping them move more efficiently throughout the body and increasing their ability to detect abnormal cells. This is another example of how a simple behavior can impact many systems at once. And if you go back to the systems perspective we talked about earlier, you will see that walking is not just a physical activity, but a way to adjust many variables at the same time, from energy, oxygen, and hormones to immunity. This explains why large-scale studies continue to show the link between physical activity and reduced cancer risk, because you are not impacting a single factor, but the entire biological environment. And the interesting thing is that you don't need to run a marathon or do high-intensity training to achieve this effect, because these studies often show that moderate activity, such as walking regularly every day, is already enough to create a meaningful difference. From a physics perspective, this makes complete sense, because you don't need a large force to change a system. You only need a small force applied continuously in the same direction. And when you understand this, walking is no longer generic advice, but becomes a specific tool for you to impact the deep mechanisms inside the body, the mechanisms that ultimately determine how the system develops over time. If you want to understand more deeply what is really happening inside the body when you walk, you need to look at how the body creates and uses energy, because at the most basic level, every cell exists based on converting energy from the environment into a form it can use. In biology, the human body mainly relies on two primary energy sources, glucose and oxygen, and the way these two factors interact determines how cells function. Under normal conditions, healthy cells use oxygen efficiently to produce energy through cellular respiration, a mechanism that allows high energy production with relatively low waste. However, as Otto Warburg pointed out back in 1931, cancer cells operate differently. They prioritize using glucose through fermentation, even when oxygen is available, which makes them less efficient in terms of energy, but more suitable for rapid proliferation. This is a very important point, because it shows that cancer cells depend heavily on a glucose-rich environment and are less dependent on oxygen, and this creates a fundamental difference between them and normal cells. When you start moving, especially walking at moderate intensity, your body immediately changes the way it uses energy, because the muscles need energy to function, and they begin to consume glucose from the blood, which leads to a reduction in circulating glucose in the circulatory system. Over time, if you maintain this habit, your body becomes more efficient at regulating blood sugar, reducing abnormal highs and lows, and this changes the environment in which cells, including abnormal ones, exist. At the same time, movement increases heart rate and blood flow, helping deliver more oxygen to the tissues. And this also has important significance, because an oxygen-rich environment is one in which healthy cells function well, but is not the ideal condition for cancer cells, according to the model Warburg described. You can imagine this like changing the conditions in a chemical reaction, where some reaction pathways become more favorable and others become less favorable. When you change the environment in the direction of increasing oxygen and reducing dependence on glucose, you are making the pathway that cancer cells prefer less efficient. This is not a direct intervention in the cell itself, but a change in the conditions that the cell must adapt to. And in many biological systems, changing environmental conditions is often the most effective way to influence the system's behavior. Another important factor is exercise intensity, because not every level of movement creates the same effect. Physiology studies show that walking at about 55 to 70% of maximum heart rate is an optimal zone where the body uses energy efficiently without creating too much stress. At this level, you activate the metabolic system without pushing the body into excessive stress, and this is very important if your goal is to maintain long-term balance. If the intensity is too low, the effect may not be strong enough to create significant change. But if it is too high, you may trigger stress responses that increase hormones like cortisol, which can have the opposite effect. Therefore, walking at moderate intensity regularly every day creates a state in which the body is continuously adjusted in an optimal direction, This affects not only glucose and oxygen, but also a whole series of other factors, such as hormones, inflammatory signals, and immune system activity. An important point to emphasize is that all these changes are not aimed at destroying cancer in the way a drug might, but at reducing the ability of abnormal cells to develop and survive. In physics, we often do not try to change a system by directly impacting each individual element, but by changing the boundary conditions, the factors that determine how the system can develop over time. Walking, in this context, is precisely a way to change those boundary conditions, making some states less likely to occur. And when you repeat this behavior every day, you are continuously reinforcing those conditions, creating a long-term trend in the way the system evolves. This is a different approach from looking for an immediate solution, because it is based on the idea that small but consistent changes can accumulate into large differences over time. And when you understand this mechanism, you will start to see that walking is not just a simple physical activity, but a tool to systematically and predictably adjust your biological environment. And whether this is effective or not, but rather how to apply it practically in daily life. Because no matter how correct an idea is, it has no value if it is not implemented consistently. Recommendations from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention show that simply walking 30 to 45 minutes every day is enough to create significant health benefits. And what matters here is not extreme intensity, but consistency. When you maintain this habit every day, you are continuously impacting the metabolic system, keeping biological processes operating in a more stable state. A factor often overlooked is the timing of your movement, because exercising in the morning is not just a convenient choice, but has a specific biological impact. The human body operates on a circadian rhythm, a roughly 24-hour cycle that controls hormones, body temperature, and many other functions. And exposure to natural light in the morning acts as a signal to reset this system. Morning sunlight directly affects the production of cortisol and melatonin, two hormones that play important roles in regulating energy, sleep, and the immune system. When you go outside for a walk in the morning, you are not only moving, but also putting your body into a more synchronized state with the natural environment. And this can improve the way other systems function throughout the day. From a biological perspective, this means you are optimizing not just one variable, but many variables at once. When you combine morning walking with hydrating right after waking up, you create a synergistic effect because you are simultaneously improving circulation, hydration, and hormonal signaling. Water helps restart the transport system, while movement enhances flow and distribution of substances in the body, and natural light helps regulate endocrine signals. These three factors together impact the system in the same direction, and in many cases this combination creates much greater effectiveness than each factor individually. Another important point is feasibility, because one reason many methods fail is that they are too complicated or require too many changes at once. Walking, on the other hand, is one of the most natural behaviors humans can perform. It requires no special equipment, no complex skills, and can be adjusted to suit almost everyone. You don't need to change your entire life to start. You only need to set aside a fixed amount of time each day and repeat that behavior. Over time, this behavior becomes part of the system, a stable condition that the body can rely on. In physics, stable systems are usually those with consistently maintained conditions, and the human body is no exception. When you create a stable habit, you are reducing variability in the system, and this often leads to more predictable outcomes. Another factor to consider is accumulation, because the effectiveness of walking does not come from a single session, but from hundreds or thousands of repetitions. Each time you walk, you create a small change in the biological environment, and when these changes accumulate over time, they can lead to significant differences in the way the system functions. This aligns with the way many natural processes occur, where small but continuous changes can lead to large results. When you look at it this way, walking is no longer an isolated activity, but part of a long-term strategy to adjust the internal environment of the body. And this brings us back to the original idea we discussed, that if you change the initial conditions of a system, you can change the probability of the outcomes that system produces. Walking, in this context, is one of the simplest ways for you to start doing that, not by trying to control every small detail, but by impacting the most fundamental factors on which the entire system depends. If you continue to delve deeper into how this system operates, you will soon realize that everything we have just talked about, from hydration, the microbiome, to movement, ultimately converges at a much deeper level, which is the level of DNA, where the basic information of life is stored and continuously copied. In every cell of yours, DNA is not an unchanging structure, but a dynamic system that is continuously affected by the external environment, such as radiation, chemicals, and even by the metabolic processes occurring inside the body. Each time a cell produces energy, it also produces byproducts like free radicals, and these molecules can collide and damage DNA. This is not an exception, but something that happens continuously, thousands of times every day in each cell. If the system had no way to handle these damages, life could not exist, and that is why the body has developed extremely sophisticated DNA repair mechanisms. Specialized enzymes constantly check and repair small deviations before they become bigger problems. However, like any other system, the efficiency of this process is not absolute and tends to decline over time. When you are young, the repair mechanisms work quickly and accurately, but as age increases, this speed and accuracy gradually decrease, and that means many small errors start to accumulate. Each individual error may not be significant, but when they accumulate over time, they can lead to changes in the way cells function. This is precisely where the concept of mutation becomes important, because a mutation is not just a random error, but the result of a process in which the system no longer repairs completely effectively. When the number of mutations exceeds a certain threshold, the cell may begin to lose control over its growth, and this is one of the important steps in the formation of cancer. From a physics perspective, you can think of this as the accumulation of small deviations in a complex system, where each individual deviation is not enough to change the entire system, but together they can lead to a completely different state. What's interesting is that although we cannot completely prevent the DNA damage process, we can influence the rate at which it occurs and the efficiency with which it is repaired. Factors such as inflammation, oxidative stress, and the metabolic environment all directly affect the level of damage and the DNA's ability to recover. This is where the habits we have talked about begin to connect with one another, because good hydration helps reduce waste buildup. A balanced microbiome helps control inflammation, and movement helps optimize metabolism, all of which contribute to creating an environment that causes less damage to DNA. But beyond reducing damage, another important question is whether we can directly support the repair system or not. For many years, scientists have studied natural compounds that can influence these mechanisms, and although this field is still being explored, there is evidence that some molecules from food can activate or support cellular protection pathways. This does not mean there is a miracle substance that can solve every problem, but that there are ways to increase the efficiency of the systems the body already has. When you look at the whole picture, you will see that cancer is not the result of a single event, but the consequence of a chain of processes occurring over time, from DNA damage, incomplete repair, mutation accumulation, to changes in cell behavior. And if each step in this chain can be influenced by the internal environment of the body, then changing that environment becomes a reasonable strategy. This does not provide absolute certainty, because in any complex system there will always be factors that cannot be fully predicted, but it shifts the probability in a favorable direction. And when you go back to the simple habits we have talked about, you will begin to see that they are not disconnected actions, but ways to reduce pressure on DNA and support the protective mechanisms operating more effectively. Understanding this is an important step because it shifts the way you look at the problem, from searching for an immediate solution to adjusting the long-term conditions of the system, where small but consistent changes can accumulate into large differences over time. And is there any way to directly support those protective mechanisms? And this is precisely where some natural compounds start to become particularly interesting. Since the 1990s, researchers at Johns Hopkins University have focused on a compound called sulforaphane, found in cruciferous vegetables such as broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and kale. And what makes this compound noteworthy is not that it cures disease in the usual sense, but the way it interacts with the deep control systems inside the cell. Instead of directly impacting a single individual process, sulforaphane has the ability to activate a series of genes related to cellular protection, especially those involved in fighting oxidative stress and detoxification. To understand this, you need to go back to the concept we mentioned earlier, that a large part of DNA damage comes from free radicals produced during metabolism. And if you can reduce the impact of these molecules, you can reduce the rate at which DNA is damaged. Sulforaphane appears to do this by activating biological pathways that enhance the ability to neutralize free radicals, while supporting the enzymes responsible for removing harmful substances before they cause serious damage. You can imagine this like strengthening the defense system of a city, where there are not only more soldiers, but also more effective detection and response systems. What's important here is that this approach is completely different from trying to repair each individual error, because instead of waiting until damage occurs and then dealing with it, you are enhancing the overall defense capability of the system. Another noteworthy point is that sulforaphane is not a new discovery in the sense that it is an artificial substance created in a laboratory, but has existed in foods that humans have consumed for centuries, which makes it an interesting example of how natural factors can interact with biology at a deep level. Laboratory and animal studies from the late 20th century showed that this compound can influence gene expression, a process that was previously thought to be quite fixed. And this opened up a new way of looking at how food can impact the body. From a physics and systems perspective, this makes sense because it shows that small changes at the molecular level can lead to large changes at the system level if they affect the right control switches. When you consume cruciferous vegetables regularly, you are not only providing basic nutrition, but also introducing biological signals that can adjust the way cells respond to the environment. This is especially important in the context we have discussed, where DNA is continuously challenged by damaging factors. If you can enhance the body's ability to resist oxidative stress and improve the efficiency of detoxification systems, you are reducing pressure on DNA and reducing the likelihood of mutation accumulation over time. It must be emphasized that this is not a single solution that can replace all other factors, because as we have seen, the body operates as a system where many factors interact with one another. But sulforaphane represents a clear example of how a natural compound can impact key points in the system. When you combine this with other habits such as hydration, movement, and microbiome balance, you are creating an environment in which protective mechanisms can operate more effectively. From a probability perspective, this means you are shifting the system in a direction where unfavorable outcomes become less likely. And when you look at the entire process as a chain of interactions rather than individual events, you will see that adding cruciferous vegetables to your diet is not random advice, but part of a broader strategy to support the body's natural protective systems to function as well as possible. If you go one step deeper into how sulforaphane actually works, you will see that what makes it special is not the molecule itself, but the way it interacts with one of the most important control systems inside the cell, a system commonly called NRF2. And you can think of NRF2 as a gene switch that coordinates the body's protective response to stress. In the normal state, NRF2 is kept at a low level because the body does not need to activate the entire defense system when there is no clear threat, but when there is a signal from the environment, such as the presence of compounds like sulforaphane, this system can be activated, leading to a chain of reactions in which a whole series of protective genes are turned on. Studies from the late 20th and early 21st centuries have shown that NRF2 can control more than 200 genes involved in processes such as antioxidation, detoxification, and cell repair. And this makes it one of the central control points of the protective system. To understand the significance of this, you need to go back to the concept of oxidative stress we mentioned earlier, where free radicals continuously attack important components of the cell, including DNA. If there is no strong enough system to neutralize these molecules, damage will accumulate over time. When NRF2 is activated, the body begins to produce more antioxidant enzymes, such as glutathione and related enzymes, helping to neutralize free radicals before they can cause serious damage. At the same time, NRF2 also activates detoxification pathways, helping to remove harmful substances from the cell. And this is especially important in the modern environment where we are exposed to more chemicals than before. From a systems perspective, you can imagine NRF2 as a coordination center, where a small signal can lead to a large response across the entire network. And this is why activating the right switch can create a powerful ripple effect. An interesting point is that this mechanism is not a new hypothesis, but has been proven in many molecular biology studies, where scientists directly observe changes in gene expression when NRF2 is activated. This provides a bridge between what we eat and the way cells respond at the most basic level. When you consume sulforaphane, you are not just putting a substance into the body, but sending a signal that can change the way hundreds of genes are expressed. This does not mean everything will change immediately, because biological systems usually respond over time and depend on many other factors, but it shows that there are ways to influence deep mechanisms without directly intervening in DNA. From a prevention perspective, this is very important, because if you can enhance the body's antioxidant and detoxification capacity, you are reducing the probability that DNA will be damaged to the point where it cannot be repaired. This does not eliminate the risk entirely, because as we have seen, the system is never perfect, but it changes the conditions in a favorable direction. In physics, when you want to reduce the likelihood of an event, you do not necessarily have to eliminate the cause completely. You only need to change the conditions so that the event becomes less likely. The mechanism involving NRF2 and sulforaphane fits this approach because it does not aim at curing a problem that has already occurred, but at reducing pressure on the system from the beginning. When you combine this with the factors we have discussed, such as reducing inflammation, improving metabolism, and optimizing the biological environment, you begin to see a clearer picture of how different factors link together. All of them converge on reducing damage and increasing protection, and NRF2 is one of the points where many of these pathways intersect. Understanding this not only helps you see the role of a specific compound clearly, but also helps you understand how the entire system responds to the environment, and why small changes in diet can have impacts far beyond what you expect when looking from the outside. So how do you actually get that benefit from everyday food? Because in biology, not only what you eat matters, but also how you prepare it plays a decisive role. Sulforaphane does not exist in a highly active form in food, but is formed when a precursor compound called glucoraphanin comes into contact with an enzyme called myrosinase. And this process occurs when you cut, chew, or crush cruciferous vegetables. This means that if this enzyme is destroyed, the ability to produce sulforaphane will decrease significantly. An important factor affecting this enzyme is temperature, because myrosinase is very sensitive to heat and can be inactivated when you cook at high temperatures for a long time. This is why the way you prepare food can make a big difference, even when you are eating the same type of food. When you boil or stir-fry broccoli for too long, you not only change the texture and flavor, but also reduce the ability to form sulforaphane. And from a biological perspective, this means you are losing a significant portion of the potential benefit. On the other hand, when you eat it raw, steam it lightly, or let the food rest for a while after cutting before cooking, you allow the enzyme to work and produce more sulforaphane. Some studies in the field of nutrition have shown that chopping broccoli and letting it sit for about 30 to 40 minutes before cooking can help maximize this compound, because the enzyme has time to complete the reaction before being affected by heat. This is a clear example of how a small detail in preparation can lead to a big difference at the biological level. Another interesting aspect is the ability to combine foods to increase effectiveness, because even if the myrosinase enzyme in the vegetables is reduced due to cooking, you can still supplement this enzyme from other sources such as mustard, radish, or raw cruciferous vegetables. When you combine these foods, you are creating conditions for the sulforaphane producing reaction to continue even if part of the original enzyme has been lost. From a systems perspective, this shows that you do not need to rely on a single factor, but can achieve the same result through many different pathways. This also fits the way the body works, where systems often have redundancy and flexibility to adapt to different conditions. When you apply these principles in practice, you start to see that nutrition is not just about choosing the right type of food, but also about understanding how to optimize its biological value. And this is where knowledge becomes important, because two people can eat the same food but receive completely different benefits simply because of the way they prepare it. In the broader context we have discussed, this illustrates a general principle that small details, when applied consistently, can create big differences over time. You don't need to change your entire diet to start. You only need to understand a few basic principles and apply them to what you are already doing. When you do that, you are increasing the effectiveness of the actions you are already taking, and this is often easier to maintain than trying to change behavior completely. From a physics perspective, this is like optimizing a system by adjusting the most important parameters instead of changing the entire structure. And when you combine this understanding with the other factors we have talked about, you start building an internal environment in the body in which protective mechanisms can operate at an optimal level. This does not provide absolute assurance, but it shifts the probability in a favorable direction. And in a complex system like the human body, that is exactly how small changes can lead to large results over time. If you look back at everything we have just gone through, from hydration, the microbiome, movement, to compounds like sulforaphane and how they impact protective mechanisms, you will see that all these factors have one thing in common. They affect the internal environment of the body in different but interconnected ways. However, although all are important, they are still not the final determining factor, because in any complex system there is always a higher layer of control, something that not only influences each individual process, but also coordinates how those processes work together. In the human body, there is such a system that operates at a foundational level, affecting nearly every function from metabolism and immunity to cell repair. When this system works properly, it helps synchronize the processes, ensuring that reactions occur at the right time and in the right sequence. But when it is disrupted, even the systems we have optimized may not function as effectively as expected. This is why two people can have the same diet, the same level of exercise, the same lifestyle habits, but have very different health outcomes, because the difference lies not only in the external factors, but also in the way the internal coordination system responds to those factors. From a physics perspective, you can think of this as a system with multiple layers, where the lower layers perform specific functions, but the entire system is controlled by a higher layer that decides when and how those functions are activated. If this control layer operates unstably, the whole system becomes less efficient, even if each individual part still functions correctly. This explains why focusing only on individual factors sometimes does not bring the expected results, because you may be optimizing the components, but overlooking how they are coordinated. When you start looking at it this way, you will see that the question is no longer what should I eat or how should I exercise, but what is controlling all these processes? And when you ask that question, you are getting closer to a deeper factor, a factor that has the potential to influence everything we have discussed so far. Understanding this is an important step because it shifts the focus from optimizing each part to understanding the overall structure of the system. In many cases, adjusting a factor at a higher level can create a much larger impact than adjusting many factors at lower levels. This does not mean that what we said before is not important. On the contrary, they create the foundation for the system to work well. But to achieve maximum effectiveness, you need to look at how the entire system is coordinated. And when you do that, you will start to see that there is a factor that plays the role of an overall switch, something that can influence the way all other systems operate. That is why, although we have gone through many different factors, we have not yet touched the most important part, the part that can change the way you look at this entire issue. To understand that, we need to go one layer deeper into how the body organizes and coordinates its processes, because it is at that level that you will find the answer to why the same set of behaviors can lead to very different outcomes, and why understanding the correct core factor can create a bigger difference than any individual change. The point we are heading toward is not a single substance or behavior, but a state in which the entire system is coordinated according to a certain rhythm. And that state is sleep, a process that most people view as simple, but in reality is one of the most complex and important biological mechanisms. Sleep is not just the time when you turn off your body to rest, but an extremely active phase at the cellular level, where a whole series of repair and reorganization processes are activated simultaneously. While you sleep, the body shifts into a completely different state compared to when you are awake, where energy is no longer prioritized for movement or quick reactions, but is used to maintain and restore the system. This is the time when DNA repair mechanisms work more strongly. Damaged proteins are recycled, and homeostasis adjustment processes are carried out systematically. One of the interesting findings in physiology is the existence of a system in the brain that helps remove waste, often called the glymphatic system, where cerebrospinal fluid flows through brain tissue and carries away byproducts of metabolisms. Although the term was named after my time, the idea that the brain needs a mechanism to remove waste has been studied before that, and what is important is that this process occurs most effectively while you sleep. You can think of this like a cleaning system that operates at night when other activities pause, allowing maintenance to be performed without interruption. If this process does not occur fully, waste will accumulate, and over time that can affect cell function. This applies not only to the brain, but also reflects a general principle throughout the entire body, that there needs to be time for the system to repair and rebalance itself. When you lack sleep, you are not simply feeling tired, but are interrupting a series of important processes from DNA repair and hormone regulation to immune system activity. From a systems perspective, this means you are allowing small errors to accumulate without the opportunity for full repair. Over time, this accumulation can lead to larger changes in the way the system operates. An important point is that sleep is not a standalone factor, but a coordinating factor that influences how all other systems function. If you recall what we have discussed about hydration, the microbiome, movement, and nutrition, all those factors depend on the state in which the body can process and integrate the signals. Sleep is precisely the period when that integration takes place. If you do not sleep enough or sleep poorly, you may still perform all the correct habits, but the system does not have the opportunity to use them effectively. This explains why sleep can be viewed as an overall switch, because it does not just affect one process, but the way the entire system is organized over time. From a physics perspective, you can think of it as synchronizing a complex oscillating system, where the components need to operate in the same rhythm to achieve maximum efficiency. When this synchronization is disrupted, Overall efficiency drops even if each individual part is still functioning. This also explains why people with the same diet and exercise level, but different sleep, have different health outcomes. Sleep is not just a part of the system, but the condition for the system to function correctly. And when you understand this, you will begin to see sleep not as something that can be sacrificed when needed, but as a foundational factor on which other factors depend. Everything we have talked about before can be strengthened or weakened depending on how you sleep, and this makes sleep one of the most important intervention points if you want to influence the way the system develops over time. This is not a conclusion based on feeling, but the logical consequence of understanding how biological processes are organized and coordinated in a complex system like the human body. If you want to understand why sleep can play the role of an overall switch for the entire system, you need to go deeper into what actually happens at the biological level when the body enters the sleep state, because this is not a passive process, but a very tightly organized phase with specific mechanisms. One of the remarkable findings in modern science is the existence of the glymphatic system, clearly described by researchers at the University of Rochester, a system that allows cerebrospinal fluid to flow through brain tissue and remove waste that accumulates during the time you are awake. What is important lies not only in the existence of this system, but in the fact that it works most effectively during deep sleep, when brain cells shrink slightly to create more space for fluid flow. You can imagine this like expanding the channels in a system to increase transport capacity. And if this process does not occur fully, waste will begin to accumulate over time. In parallel with this process, the body also adjusts the activity of many important hormones, among which melatonin is a prominent example. Melatonin is not simply a sleep hormone, as many people think, but has a much deeper biological role, especially in protecting cells from oxidative stress. During deep sleep, melatonin levels rise significantly, and this helps enhance the ability to neutralize free radicals, reducing pressure on DNA and other cellular structures. From a systems perspective, you can view melatonin as part of the protection network, operating simultaneously with the antioxidant enzymes we talked about earlier. Another interesting point is that melatonin also influences the immune system, especially the body's ability to recognize and respond to abnormal cells. Although the detailed mechanisms are still being studied, there is evidence that good quality sleep helps maintain the effective activity of immune cells responsible for detecting and eliminating abnormal cells. This fits with the systems view we have built, where repair, detoxification, and immune processes do not operate separately, but are coordinated within the same time window. When you lack sleep, you are not only interrupting one process, but weakening the entire chain of these mechanisms, from reducing the efficiency of the glymphatic system in removing waste, to decreasing melatonin production and weakening antioxidant capacity, and ultimately affecting immune system function. The result is that the internal environment of the body becomes less optimal, with more waste, more oxidative stress, and less effective cell surveillance. In a complex system, these changes do not need to be large to create significant impact, because they accumulate over time and affect many processes at once. This explains why chronic sleep deprivation is often linked to many different health problems, not because it causes one specific issue, but because it weakens the foundation on which many systems depend. When you go back to the factors we discussed earlier, you will see that sleep not only complements them, but conditions their effectiveness, because processes such as DNA repair, antioxidant enzyme activity, or immune response all achieve highest efficiency when the body has enough time and conditions to perform them in a rested state. From a physics perspective, this is like a system needing time to rebalance and remove deviations before continuing to operate. And if that time is shortened or interrupted, the deviations accumulate. Understanding this mechanism helps you see clearly that sleep is not a secondary factor, but a central part of the system, where many important processes converge and are coordinated. And when you start looking at sleep this way, you will realize that improving sleep quality and duration is not just to feel better the next day, but to maintain a biological environment in which protective mechanisms can operate at an optimal level, reducing pressure on DNA and other systems, and thereby influencing the way the entire system develops over time. Do these mechanisms really create measurable differences in reality? And this is where data becomes important, because science does not stop at theory, but tests those predictions on a large scale. One of the notable assessments comes from the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the Cancer Research Agency of the World Health Organization. When they reviewed evidence related to circadian rhythm disruption and classified night shift work, especially long-term night shifts, into the group with possible carcinogenicity. This does not mean that everyone who works night shifts will get the disease, but shows that disrupting the natural sleep-wake cycle can create unfavorable biological conditions over time. When you think about this in the context of what we have said, it becomes reasonable, because changing sleep timing is not just changing the clock, but changing the entire signals the body uses to coordinate processes. In addition, many epidemiological studies have shown that people who sleep less than about 6 hours per night have a higher risk for many health problems, including some types of cancer. And although the specific numbers may vary between studies, the general trend is quite consistent. This shows that lack of sleep does not just affect subjective feelings, but is linked to real changes in the biological system. Another example comes from research at the University of California, San Diego, where scientists followed a large group of participants for many years and found that those who maintained adequate sleep had significantly lower cancer mortality rates, with some analyses showing a reduction of up to about 48% compared to those who slept insufficiently or poorly. This number must be understood carefully, because it does not mean that sleep prevents cancer in a direct way, but reflects the connection between sleep and the entire biological environment we have discussed. When you combine these data with the known mechanisms, the picture becomes clearer, because you have not only correlation, but also a foundation explaining why that correlation exists. From a scientific perspective, this is one of the strongest signs that a factor can play an important role when both observational data and biological mechanisms point to the same conclusion. This does not completely eliminate other factors, because in a complex system like the human body, many variables influence the outcome together. But it shows that sleep is one of the variables with broad and deep impact. Another important point is the consistency of the results across many different populations, from office workers to shift workers, from different age groups to different cultures, all showing a similar trend when sleep is disrupted. This reduces the possibility that the results are merely random or due to some confounding factor. When you go back to the system's view, you will see that this fits perfectly, because sleep does not impact a single process, but the way the entire system is coordinated over time. When this coordination is disrupted, the efficiency of many other processes also decreases, and this can lead to the accumulation of unfavorable factors. From a probability perspective, this means you are changing the conditions in a direction that increases the likelihood of unwanted outcomes. Conversely, when you maintain adequate and quality sleep, you are creating an environment in which protective mechanisms can operate at an optimal level, and this is reflected in the data we observe. What is important is to understand that sleep is not a tip or a small additional factor, but a foundational part of the system, a condition on which many other processes depend. When you ignore it, you are not only missing an individual benefit, but weakening the entire structure on which other benefits are built. And when you look at the data together with the mechanisms, you will see that this conclusion is not speculation, but the logical consequence of the way the system operates, where maintaining the right conditions can create large differences in the way processes unfold over time. Once you have seen both the mechanisms and the data clearly, the next step is no longer debating whether sleep is important, but how you can redesign the conditions so that this system works correctly in everyday reality, because in biology, a process only operates optimally when its conditions are maintained stably. One of the most important factors is the consistency of sleep timing. because the human body operates on a circadian rhythm, an internal cycle of about 24 hours that coordinates hormones, temperature, and the activity of many other systems. And when you go to bed and wake up at different times each day, you are continuously shifting this control signal. When you maintain a stable bedtime, you help the system synchronize, allowing processes such as melatonin production, cell repair, and immune activity to occur at the right time. The sleep environment also plays an equally important role because light and temperature are two primary signals the body uses to determine when to shift into the rest state. A dark and cool space helps stimulate melatonin production, the hormone we talked about with its role in cell protection and immune support. Even a small amount of light in the evening can interrupt this process because the light-sensing system in the eyes sends direct signals to the circadian control center in the brain. This explains why exposure to strong light from phone or computer screens before bed can reduce sleep quality, not because it simply keeps you alert, but because it sends the wrong signal to the coordination system. When you reduce light exposure before bed, you allow melatonin to rise naturally, creating better conditions for the body to shift into the rest state effectively. Besides that, what you do in the period before sleep also significantly affects this process because the body does not switch states instantly, but needs time to adjust. Strongly stimulating activities, both physical and mental, can keep the nervous system in a high activity state, slowing the transition to rest. Conversely, more stable and less stimulating habits, such as light reading or maintaining a familiar routine before bed, can help the system recognize that it is time to reduce activity. From a systems perspective, you can think of this as gradually reducing energy in an oscillating system to bring it to a stable state. When all these factors are combined, from stable sleep timing and suitable environment to pre-sleep habits, you are creating a set of conditions in which sleep not only occurs, but occurs with high quality. This is meaningful because sleep quality, not just the number of hours, determines the extent to which repair and regeneration processes can take place. When you optimize sleep in this way, you are not only improving one individual aspect, but impacting the entire system, from reducing oxidative stress and improving immune function to supporting DNA repair. This brings us back to the principle we discussed from the beginning, that when you change the conditions of the system, you change the way the system responds. Sleep in this case is one of the most basic conditions, and optimizing it does not require complicated changes, but understanding and consistently applying simple principles. When you do that, you are not only improving how you feel each day, but also creating an internal environment where protective mechanisms can operate more effectively. And over time, this can lead to significant differences in the way the system develops. Looking back at everything we have gone through, one thing becomes clear. These habits are not disconnected pieces, but components of a larger system, where each element influences the others in ways you cannot see if you only look at each factor individually. Hydration affects circulation and waste removal. The microbiome affects inflammation and immunity. Movement changes the energy and oxygen environment. Nutrition impacts gene expression, and sleep coordinates all those processes over time. When you combine all these factors, you do not just add up the benefits of each part, but create a synergistic effect where the total impact is much greater than the sum of the individual parts. In physics, this is a familiar phenomenon where components in a system interact with one another to produce behaviors that you cannot predict by looking at each part independently. The human body works in a similar way, and this explains why small changes in the right places can lead to large results over time. An important point is balance, because the body does not aim to maximize a single function, but to maintain a stable state among many different processes. If one factor deviates too far, it can pull other parts out of balance. The habits we have discussed are not intended to push the system to a new extreme, but to help it maintain its natural balanced state. When you drink enough water, You are not boosting the lymphatic system beyond what is needed, but helping it function correctly. When you eat foods that support the microbiome, you are not replacing the immune system, but helping it receive more accurate signals. When you move, you are not forcing the body to overwork, but creating conditions for metabolic processes to occur more efficiently. And when you sleep enough, you are not adding a new function, but allowing what already exists to operate as it was designed. From a systems perspective, this is a very different approach from looking for a single solution to a specific problem, because you are not trying to fix a broken part, but adjusting the entire system to reduce the chance of errors occurring in the first place. This also explains why people with the same individual habit, but different overall lifestyles, have different outcomes, because effectiveness does not come from one factor, but from the way the factors interact with one another. When you understand this, you will begin to see that improving health is not a checklist of things to do, but a process of adjusting conditions so the system operates optimally. This not only makes the actions more meaningful, but also helps you prioritize the most important factors correctly. Instead of trying to do everything at once, you can focus on the changes that have the potential to create the largest ripple effects. This is how science approaches complex systems, by identifying high impact points and acting on them. In this case, the habits we have discussed are exactly such points, because they do not just affect one process, but many processes at once. When you apply them consistently, you are creating an internal environment in the body where protective mechanisms can operate more effectively. And over time, this changes the probability of the outcomes the system produces. Understanding the system not only helps you know what to do, but also helps you understand why you are doing it. And this very understanding makes the behavior more sustainable, because you are no longer relying on short-term motivation, but on a verifiable logic. And when you approach health in this way, you are no longer looking for a quick fix, but building a long-term foundation where small but consistent changes accumulate into large differences over time. One important point that needs to be clarified to avoid misunderstanding the whole issue is that no method, whether nutrition, movement, or any other intervention, can guarantee complete prevention of cancer, because in a complex system like the human body, there are always random factors and variables that we cannot fully control. This is not a limitation of science, but a natural feature of complex systems where outcomes are never absolute, but always probabilistic. However, the inability to achieve absolute certainty does not mean we cannot influence the outcome, because between cannot control completely and cannot influence, there is a very large gap. Epidemiological studies over many decades have shown that you can significantly reduce the risk of cancer through lifestyle changes, and numbers such as 30%, 40%, or even higher in some cases are not small values. From a scientific perspective, this is understood through probability, where each factor you change does not completely eliminate risk, but shifts the probability distribution in a favorable direction. You can imagine this like changing the conditions in a physics experiment, where you cannot guarantee a single outcome, but can make one outcome more likely than the others. In the body, the internal environment serves as those conditions, including the level of inflammation, oxidative state, hormone balance, immune activity, and many other factors we have discussed. Each habit you apply, from drinking enough water and eating properly, to exercising and sleeping enough, contributes to adjusting one or more variables in this system. When the variables change in the same direction, their combined effect can lead to a significant shift in the probability of processes such as the development of abnormal cells. This also explains why science never makes absolute statements, but instead talks about risk, rates, and trends, because that is the only accurate way to describe what happens in a complex system. Understanding this helps you avoid the two common extremes. One is believing everything is beyond control and there is nothing you can do, and the other is believing that a single change can solve the entire problem. Reality lies in between, where you may not control everything, but can influence enough factors to create a meaningful difference. From a systems perspective, this means you are adjusting the environment to make unfavorable states less stable and favorable states easier to maintain. In many cases, the difference between the two states does not lie in a single factor, but in the accumulation of many small changes over time. This fits the way natural processes occur, where small but consistent changes can lead to large results. When you apply this view to health, you begin to see that the goal is not to achieve perfection, but to shift the system in the most favorable direction possible. This is not only more realistic, but also more consistent with the way science understands the world. And when you look at the issue this way, the habits we have discussed are no longer optional choices, but become tools for you to adjust probability in a direction that benefits you. That is exactly how science approaches the problem, not by seeking absolute certainty, but by understanding and impacting the factors that can be changed to create better outcomes over time. One of the most common misunderstandings about science is the expectation that it must provide absolutely certain answers, while in reality, science does not work that way. It does not promise guarantees, but provides models that help us understand how the world operates. In physics, we build models to describe the behavior of systems, and these models are not reality, but good enough approximations to predict outcomes under certain conditions. An equation is not the phenomenon itself, but it gives you the ability to predict what will happen when you change a variable, and that ability is what matters. Biology also operates on the same principle, only differing in that the system is much more complex, with billions of interactions occurring simultaneously, making precise prediction more difficult, but not impossible to approach. Models of metabolism, immunity, or cell development are not rigid rules, but explanatory frameworks that help us understand trends and probabilities of different outcomes. The real value of a model lies not in it being absolutely correct, but in it helping you make better decisions than when you do not have it. In the context of health, this means you do not need to know exactly what will happen in each of your cells, but need to understand enough to adjust the factors with the greatest influence. What we have discussed, from hydration, the microbiome, movement, nutrition, to sleep, are all parts of a larger model about how the body maintains balance and how it departs from that state. When you understand this model, you begin to see the connections between daily behaviors and processes occurring at deeper levels, and this allows you to act with clear purpose instead of just following disconnected advice. Knowledge in this case is not a set of information to memorize, but a structure that helps you organize and interpret that information in a meaningful way. From a risk perspective, this is especially important because you cannot completely eliminate risk in a complex system, but you can reduce it by changing the factors you understand to have influence. Science provides you with a way to evaluate those factors, not through intuition or belief, but through tested data and mechanisms. This does not make decisions easy in every case, but makes them more rational, because you are relying on a model capable of explaining and predicting. In many situations, the difference between a good outcome and a bad outcome does not lie in one single big decision, but in a series of small decisions made in the same direction over a long time. Understanding the model helps you recognize what that direction is and keep your choices consistent. This also changes the way you view uncertainty, because instead of seeing it as an obstacle, you can view it as a natural part of the system and focus on adjusting the factors within your control. In health, this means you do not need to search for a perfect solution or a final answer, but need to build a set of conditions that make good outcomes more likely over time. Knowledge does not eliminate risk, but makes risk manageable, and this is much more important than trying to eliminate uncertainty completely. From a scientific perspective, this is the most practical approach you can apply because it fits the nature of complex systems. And when you start thinking this way, you are not only changing how you care for your body, but also changing how you approach problems in life in general, because you are learning to work with the laws of systems instead of fighting against them. And that is an important shift from seeking certainty to building the best possible conditions to achieve the desired results.
And one of the reasons many people do not achieve the expected results in improving health does not lie in their lack of information, but in the way they approach the problem. because most people tend to look for a quick solution, a single change that can bring immediate results, while overlooking the foundational factors on which the system really depends. This way of thinking is understandable because humans are often drawn to simple solutions for complex problems, but in systems like the human body, such solutions rarely exist. What we have discussed shows that important biological processes are not dominated by a single factor, but by the interaction of many small factors. And it is these small factors, when repeated consistently, that create the difference over time. A small change in hydration, an adjustment in diet, a regular exercise habit, or stable sleep, each individual factor may not create a clear change immediately. But when they accumulate, they begin to reshape the internal environment of the body in a predictable direction. From a systems perspective, this is how large changes often occur, not through sudden leaps, but through the gradual accumulation of small adjustments. The issue is that these changes require time, and in a world accustomed to quick results, that can cause many people to give up before seeing the effect. This is where understanding plays an important role, because when you understand why a behavior matters, you no longer depend entirely on immediate results to maintain it. You do not need to feel the change right away to know that it is happening at a deeper level. This shifts your motivation from seeking short-term rewards to building a long-term system. In many cases, the difference between people who maintain habits and those who do not lies not in the level of discipline, but in the level of understanding of what they are doing. When a behavior has clear meaning within a model you understand, it becomes easier to maintain because it is no longer a separate task but part of a larger system. This also changes the way you evaluate progress, because instead of looking for immediate clear changes, you start paying attention to consistency and trends over time. From a scientific perspective, this is a more appropriate approach to the nature of biological processes where many changes occur slowly and accumulatively. Another important point is sustainability, because any change that cannot be maintained over a long time will ultimately not create significant impact. The simple habits we have talked about have a big advantage in that they can be integrated into daily life without requiring extreme changes. You do not need to restructure your entire life. You only need to adjust some basic behaviors and maintain them. Over time, these behaviors become a natural part of the system, and then you no longer have to try to perform them. This is an important transition from relying on willpower to relying on structure, where the environment and habits support the desired behavior. From a physics perspective, this is like establishing the initial conditions of a system so that it naturally progresses toward the state you want. When the conditions are set correctly, you do not need to continuously intervene to maintain that state. And that is the sustainable approach, not by forcing the system to change quickly, but by adjusting the conditions so that change occurs naturally over time. Understanding this helps you escape the cycle of searching for quick solutions and shift to a deeper approach where you build the foundation for your health in a way that fits how the system actually operates. The final point that everything we have said truly leads to is not a list of habits or a specific formula to follow, but a change in the way you perceive your own body and the way nature operates. Because the human body, like any system in the universe, does not operate based on will, hope, or belief, but functions according to very specific laws. In physics, we never ask what a system wants to do. We ask how it will react under certain conditions, and that allows us to predict its behavior with high accuracy. Your body is no different. It does not care what you hope will happen. It only reacts to the signals you provide every day through the internal environment, through what you eat, how you move, how you sleep, and how you maintain your habits. This may sound impersonal, but in reality it gives you a very real control, because if a system follows laws, you can learn to work with those laws instead of trying to fight against them. You do not control every variable. There are always factors beyond your reach, from the external environment and genetic factors to random deviations occurring at the cellular level. But that does not mean you have no influence. You may not decide the final outcome in each specific case, but you can influence the conditions from which those outcomes arise, and in many systems, changing the initial conditions is the most effective way to change the results. When you improve hydration, you are changing the way waste is transported and removed. When you adjust the microbiome, you are changing the way the immune system recognizes and responds. When you move, you are changing the way energy and oxygen are distributed. When you add compounds like sulforaphane, you are influencing the way genes are expressed. And when you sleep enough, you are coordinating all those processes according to the rhythm the body is designed to operate in. Each of these changes, looked at individually, may not create a clear difference immediately, but when they are repeated consistently, they begin to accumulate and interact with one another, creating an internal environment in which some states become more stable and others become harder to maintain. This is not magic, not a mysterious process, but the logical consequence of the way complex systems operate over time. In physics, when you change the boundary conditions of a system, you do not need to intervene directly in each element to change the overall behavior. The system will adjust itself based on the new conditions, and the human body also responds in a similar way. What makes many people find it hard to accept is not the principle itself, but the fact that it does not provide absolute certainty. But absolute certainty has never been the way nature operates. Nature does not make promises. It does not guarantee outcomes. It only responds consistently to the conditions you create. This also means that what you do is not about seeking a certain outcome, but about shifting probability in the most favorable direction possible. In a system where everything is probabilistic, that is the most practical approach. This also changes your role in the entire process, because you are no longer the person trying to control every small detail or searching for a single solution that can solve every problem, but the person who establishes the conditions for the system to operate in the most beneficial way. This is an important shift from a control mindset to a collaborative mindset, where you work with natural laws instead of trying to overcome them. When you understand this, the habits we have discussed are no longer tasks that must be completed or rules to follow, but become tools for you to adjust the system in a purposeful way. You do not need to be perfect, because a system does not require perfection to function better. It only needs enough consistency to create a clear trend over time. Each small action you repeat every day is a signal, and when those signals are consistent, the system begins to adapt to them. Over time, that adaptation becomes the new state, and that state is what determines the outcome. This is how many processes in nature occur, not through sudden changes, but through the accumulation of small adjustments. Applying this principle to health does not guarantee that you will avoid every problem, but makes good outcomes more likely. And in a system where you cannot completely eliminate risk, systematically reducing risk is the most reasonable goal. Understanding this not only changes the way you view health, but also changes the way you view the world, because you begin to see that outcomes are not completely random events, but consequences of conditions and laws. When you learn to recognize and work with those laws, you no longer depend on luck, but rely on an understanding that can be applied and verified. And that is the real value of science, not providing final answers, but providing a way for you to interact with the world more effectively. And in this case, to interact with your own body in a way that fits how it is designed to operate. If you find this perspective useful, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss deeper scientific analyses about the body and the universe. See you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the hidden laws behind the world you are living in.